I'm Jamie Horn with Cranky Kangaroo. In part one of this workshop, I'm going to show you my quilt setup and how I use a small machine on a big frame to get huge results, including turning a quilt into a dress. In part two, we're going to work on a special project using our scraps and leftovers, and I think you'll really enjoy it, and even a beginner can make it. So stick with me for part one. I'm going to give you a tour of my machine and my grace frame, and I'll give you some tips and pointers if you have limited space as well. My primary quilting machine is actually just a household machine on my grace frame. My grace frame is a king, so I can get a lot done on it, but my machine is just a little household juki. So she's got a little throat space, and I've had to get creative and really figure things out. So I'm going to give you some tips on how maybe you can make use of a household machine on a grace frame. Now, the thing I really do like about her is I can always upgrade the machine and keep the frame. So when I bought her in 2016, and by the way, I've named her Alice. When I bought Alice in 2016, I was on a budget like most people are, and this was the most economical way for me to get into free motion quilting. I could get the frame, which made most of the difference, and the machine I can always upgrade later, but at the time it was a great deal, and so I went with it, and I really enjoyed it. But she does have a small throat space, especially comparatively to some of the larger free motion machines. So here's some things that I do to really make use of my space. I've created and completed large projects on this machine, but it does take forethought and planning and some creativity. So here's some ways that you can make use of your small space. The first tip when you have a small space that you're working with is to plan ahead. So make use of quilt diagrams and photos and anything that you can design on before actually taking it to your frame. So if you have a quilt diagram, you can plan it out, you can draw on it either digitally or printed and with pen and ink, but somehow figure out how you're going to put the quilt on the frame. So sometimes I have to put it vertically with the narrow edges on the frame. It takes up space more quickly, but sometimes that's just how the quilt needs to be quilted. If I can, I will put the quilt on the frame horizontally so that the longest edge of the quilt is what I actually attach to the frame. That makes the best use of the throat space because I don't have as much quilt to wind up onto the take-up bar. So plan it out, think it through. Sometimes I even have to move the quilt halfway through. You know, I either have to rotate it 90 degrees or a full 180 degrees and flip it around. But if you think it through and just do a little bit of research ahead of time, it'll really make the best use of your frame and your machine. You can also pick motifs based on your throat space. So when I'm looking for a free motion design or a pantograph design, I'm really looking for something that I can scale to my machine size, my throat size. So if it's like a 12-inch pantograph, if I shrink it down to my 8 inches, maybe even only 7 inches, by the time I get some quilt rolled up in there, if I'm gonna shrink it down that much and then there's so much detail, it's just gonna get lost in the quilting, I won't use that one. I'm really looking for something that when I shrink it down, it's not going to be so detailed that I will spend so much time quilting and then I'll lose either details or it'll just be too tight of a quilting motif at that point. I'm really looking for versatility in a quilting design. So here's a really good example of this concept. Here's 2 pantograph designs, and this one is a nice open space. It also has multiple repeats within, so if you have a larger throat space, you might even do 3 repeats before you advance your quilt. However, I will probably only get 1 row. I won't even be able to hit down here, so I can shrink this and I'm still able to quilt this motif. I won't lose any detail. The quilting won't be so tight that I won't like it, but If I was to shrink this, it would be so tight and detailed. It would be miserable to try and quilt this on a smaller scale. So keep that in mind when you're choosing your quilting motifs. You have to think about how much space you have and how shrinking a design will impact the tightness of the quilting. The second tip to keep in mind when working on a small space is to make use of your frame. So there are several ways I can do this. If I get about halfway done, or maybe more than halfway done on a quilt, and I've rolled up so much of it that I'm really losing out on throat space, I will take the rails off the machine and completely flip them all around. And that puts the other end of the quilt up by the machine, and I just reverse roll them so that now I'm working from the center out, and I gain a little bit of throat space by doing that. It's a little bit of work, but if you have a quilt that must be put on the frame in one direction, or that is just really detailed and you really want to be able to work that detail the whole way through, flipping those rails around are a big help. So earlier this year, I turned a quilt into a dress. And it has been a huge hit. I learned a lot along the way, and I did have to take into use some of the tips I've given you here. Really plan out the quilting. This quilt has swoops or swipes that go in multiple directions, and I wanted to follow those swooshes in the quilting. They all kind of lead into that center vortex. The quilt is called the Vortex by Legit Kits, and I wanted to follow those swipes when I was quilting, and so in order to do that, some of them run vertically and then they turn and run horizontally. So I thought it through. I used the diagrams to really plan it out, and sure enough, I did some of the quilting horizontally and then turned the quilt 90 degrees and did some of it vertically, and just really thought through what would work best and what I can use the limited space I have. It does take forethought, it does take planning, but I have never regretted my decision to get the Grace frame and the Juki to go on it, and I can make good use of it with a little creativity. So I did make mistakes along the way, don't get me wrong. There's always something we can learn from our mistakes, and I made some big ones, including cutting the fabric wrong in order to cut out my dress. You just have to learn how to adapt. I just had to keep reminding myself through the process that it's just a quilt. Yeah, I put time into it, and I was happy with my quilt, but in the end, this is the result I wanted. This is what I wanted to get out of it. So to me, the risk was worth the potential reward, and I am very happy that I went forward with it. So never be afraid to try something new, and tell yourself, what's the worst that could happen? Like, you mess up some fabric? Okay, keep moving forward and learn from that mistake. I feel like that's one of the most important things as a quilter we can do, is learn from our mistake, but don't be afraid to make them. And in true scrappy fashion, I made shoes out of the leftover from cutting out the dress. As much fun as I had making the dress, clearly I have just as much fun wearing the dress. I love having the conversation starter, so when I'm at quilt shows and events, I talk to people about the dress and they're usually shocked to find out that I did make it on such a small machine, just that little Juki with an 8-inch throat space on the Grace frame. And so it's a point of pride for me to be able to tell people that they can do big things even with smaller machines. So I'm working on a project that we're going to use to make our bags on the workshop part 2. And while I'm working on this, I'm going to show you a couple tips for making use of the small space. This is something that I wish I had thought of or known of a long time ago, because we have so many fabric scraps and this is an amazing way to use them up. So I just have some yardage loaded onto the machine, and I have my scrap batting. So it's not even full pieces of batting. I just have whatever's left over. I'm going to make use of that, and I've layered that on the frame on top of the backing fabric, and it can overlap. You don't have to worry about sewing it together before you put it on the frame. Just overlap it. We're making bags, so a little bit of bulkiness in one area will not make a huge difference. So layer your batting so that it just overlaps where it needs to. Use up all your scraps, small pieces, large pieces. These are great for those long edge pieces that we cut off usually when we're making a quilt and there's just a little bit along one edge. So I'm using all of my batting scraps, and then I have all of these cut-offs from the quilt I'm currently working on, and I am just putting those, I'm just sprinkling them like I'm making a pizza, and I'll sprinkle those on top of the batting. Now even if some of the batting shows, that's okay too, because again, we're making bags and we're going to quilt it, and usually batting manufacturers will tell you how far apart your quilting needs to be. Now we're going to quilt well within those parameters, so even if a little bit of batting shows, it's okay. But cover it up, sprinkle it on as you like, cover up any spaces that you see until you're happy with it. And then we're using either organza or netting, and either of these will work. I actually went to my fabric shop and went to the remnant bin and just grabbed a bunch of leftovers. So you can usually get them half off. They're rolled up usually with a new price on them, but anything sheer like this will work. Even a brightly colored one, when you put it on top of your fabric and the batting, will not show as brightly as you think it will. So I have some red, some black, and some neon green, and we'll see how it all works in the end. But you're just going to use up what you have or what you like. You can mess around with it until you like the look, and until you're happy with what you see. I've even got some threads in here. Whatever scraps you have, you can throw in here because we're going to sandwich them together. There we go. And then we're going to put that netting right on top of all of our scraps. So I've got organza here and netting here, but it all works together, and we'll cut it up later and make good use of it. I'm going to put some more netting in this area. And your netting can overlap just like your batting overlaps. So I'm working on my free motion, and this is a great opportunity to practice and have fun and not worry about how it looks, because this is just good practice. So I've actually done several different kinds of quilting on this quilt. And then over here, I have some grid lines. So I'm just using this to practice, to see which one I like best, to practice thread colors, to see what impact thread colors has on the final result. And see, this section here has red netting over it. You can barely tell which color netting is on top of the fabric. So have fun, pick out some fun stuff, and just see what you end up liking. So I'm going to quilt for a bit and finish up this row, and then I'll show you how I make use of my quilt frame to get some nice straight line quilting without having a channel lock. So I'm going to show you one of my favorite ways to actually make good use of the small throat space, and that's straight line quilting. Now, I don't have a channel lock on my machine, so here's what I do to get a straight line without any extra accessories or built-in functions of the machine. I'm going to make use of this back rail and ride the machine against that back rail. Now, if you've attached your quilt with pins, just be mindful that the pin heads might make a little bump when you roll them up and they're exactly on the back of the frame. So keep that in mind. But I use a zipper leader, so I don't have to worry about bumps back there. And I'm going to pull my machine all the way forward and make sure that my quilt is positioned so that all the way out here is where I'm going to start. And I will just gently pull the machine forward, letting the back of the machine ride against that back rail. And I will pull it all the way across and get a nice straight line. I'm not pulling so hard that I'm pulling the machine so far into the back roll that it'll distort the line. I'm really just gently making sure it stays flush against that back bar and riding it all the way down. Now I come back to the beginning and I will advance this bar, and I go by clicks. So it's completely up to you. If you want really close straight line stitching, almost like matchstick stitching, you can just do one little click. Let me go release this other end. You can just do one little click if you want really close stitching. Drop one stitch, one click, or you can do several. And I'm going to do, I think 2 is good. It'll stay pretty close and still make quick progress. And I'm just going to do the same thing going down the next line. And wherever you come across where your layers, like your organza or your netting, butts up to another layer of organza or netting, you will have to be careful going across it. So raise your presser foot if you need to, or just go across that transition carefully. So I'm going to keep advancing my rails, those same 2 clicks at a time. And just make the same straight line all the way across. I love how this turned out, and even though there are different textures and colors and layers and different fabrics, I can either make use of that in what I make, or I can cut around it. So the size of, say, a piece of netting might dictate the size of the bag I make depending on the look it has, but I am really happy with this. Now, even if you don't have scraps that you want to use, you can use anything for this technique, really, because we're going to transform it into something else. So use some yardage that you have. You can load a piece of fabric onto the frame as your backing, use some batting or some batting scraps, and then load something on top that you really like. This is a really good way to use larger pieces of fabric. Sometimes in our stash we have fabric that we love that we can't bring ourselves to cut into for small pieces. But when you're making a bag, it's going to be in larger pieces, so you might not feel as afraid to cut into it if it's a really nice big motif that you love. Use it for this. Let's make a bag out of it. That would be an excellent thing to use. Because the amazing thing about this is that we're going to transform them into something else. So when you're quilting a quilt, you might feel like you're intimidated because that's what's going to show is the quilting on the quilt. But when we transform it into something else, it's the object that will show. It's the object that you'll pay attention to. You won't pay attention to the quilting because they'll say, "What an amazing bag you have! What an amazing quilted bag you have!" But they won't say, "How did you quilt that and why did you use that thread color?" I promise they won't. You can also use large pieces of fabric to make clothing. This is a printed panel. So it's great to practice on because you don't have to put in the work to piece together a quilt. You can use the printed panel and quilt it and still do things like quilt in the ditch, but you would just use the picture to quilt around. So have fun with it, experiment, work outside of your comfort zone. In the next workshop, we're going to use the fabric that we made today with our scraps or with our yardage, and we're going to make a bag. It's an easy project. Anyone can do it, and I think it'll be a lot of fun too. So I will see you in part 2. Remember, make use of the space you have, even if it takes a little bit of creativity, but have fun with it and challenge yourself. Don't be afraid to take chances and risks and learn something new along the way, even if you learn from a mistake. I'll see you in part 2.